In this video, I will be talking about the economics of testing, myths, and facts.
My name is Rob Scharff. I'm a food safety economist currently at The Ohio State University. I've been working in the field of food safety economics for over 20 years, including some time working at the FDA as a regulatory economist. I look forward to talking to you today about the economics of testing.
The approach I'd like to take today is to look at some common myths that people have with regard to food safety in general, but more specifically about produce testing. These myths include farmers must be forced to be safe, intensive testing is cost effective, buyers can reduce liability by requiring testing, and testing costs can be passed on to the consumer. I will examine each of these in turn. The first myth I'd like to discuss is the idea that farmers must be forced to be safe. The basic claim here is that farmers will not produce safe food unless it is required by either government or buyers. Do the facts support this? I think not. The most important thing to understand about farmers is that they respond to incentives. As a business, the farm's primary incentive is to make profit. As it turns out, safe food sells. If it becomes known that a farm is not producing safe food, that farm will quickly lose customers. Related to this, food safety events such as recalls and outbreaks are incredibly costly to farms. To avoid these costs, farms will invest in safety. Farmers also respond to incentives created by their personal ethics. Farmers are people, and as such are likely to have strong beliefs about not harming others. This creates a strong secondary incentive to produce safe foods. The incentive for farmers to be safe has grown over time. Improved traceability has made it less likely that unsafe conditions will go undetected. The detection of costly outbreaks and recalls provides strong incentives to produce safe foods. This is true even for farms that only care about profit and don't face regulatory or buyer requirements. So how do these incentives affect the interventions chosen? Well, food safety interventions will be chosen to maximize profits while minimizing risk. How do they do this? Well, every farm is different, so there's no single best solution for all farms. What is generally true, however, is that a mix of risk mitigation methods will be employed. Testing is likely to be one of many tools for accomplishing this. So is it true that farmers must be forced to be safe? No, this myth is clearly busted. Farmers have strong incentives to produce safe food. This does not mean farmers always have optimal food safety incentives. Regulators and buyers can help farmers produce safer foods, but a one-size-fits-all solution is often counterproductive. Also, there will always be unscrupulous outliers who ignore incentives. Unfortunately, these types of operations are often very good at hiding their shady practices from regulators and buyers alike. The Peanut Corporation of America, for example, had intensive buyer-mandated testing requirements, but was only caught after their peanuts led to a massive outbreak involving numerous deaths. The next myth that I would like to examine is the idea that intensive testing is cost-effective. The claim here is that routine intensive pathogen testing is generally cost-effective. What is routine intensive pathogen testing? Well, an example might help here. Some have suggested that farms that test every quarter acre of produce harvested for all relevant pathogens just prior to harvest or shipment can achieve zero risk at modest cost. Is this true? Well, let's look at the facts. Most importantly, we need to recognize that optimal testing will differ for every farm. This is true because all farms are different, which affects both risk levels and the feasibility of risk mitigation interventions. A number of factors affect what the optimal level of testing should be. These include environmental attributes such as climate, adjacent land uses, the presence of wildlife, and soil and water characteristics. Farm attributes such as farm size, production processes, and preventative measures also affect what the optimal level of testing is. Farmers, in consultation with extension specialists, are in the best position to determine optimal testing. They are most knowledgeable about their farm's characteristics and are highly incentivized to produce safe food. When considering testing requirements, it's also important to understand that routine intensive testing will never lead to zero risk, but it can give a false sense of security. This, combined with the fact that intensive routine testing is expensive, may lead farmers with limited resources to focus on testing at the expense of other more effective mitigations. That being said, intensive testing is justified in the context of process validation or in solving an identified problem. What can we say about the claim that routine pathogen testing is generally cost-effective? I think we can conclude that this is a myth that is at least partially busted. Routine intensive testing aimed at eliminating risk is typically not cost-effective and could be counterproductive. However, intensive pathogen testing may be an important part of process validation or may be an important response to an identified problem. The third myth I'd like to discuss is the idea that testing reduces liability for buyers. The claim here is that buyers can reduce their firm's liability by requiring testing. Is this true? Let's look at the facts. First, most states employ strict liability for products, including foods that are sold. This legal doctrine does not look at the safety measures employed by a firm. Instead, it focuses on whether harm occurred. In most cases, this means that buyers and farmers are both liable for all harms from the products they sell. This is true regardless of the level of testing, because due care is irrelevant. What this ultimately means is that testing will typically only reduce liability to the extent that it reduces risk. So what can we say about the claim that buyers can reduce liability by requiring testing? I would say this is mostly busted. In most states, buyer testing requirements only affect the level of risk, not the finding of fault. As discussed on earlier slides, testing requirements may actually lead to greater risk if they lead to a false sense of security or there are limited resources for food safety. As always, please check with local legal counsel to determine the laws of your state and whether the conclusions reached here apply to your firm. The final potential myth I'd like to discuss is the idea that there is no harm from requiring testing because, ultimately, consumers will pay this cost. The claim here is that all testing costs can be passed on to consumers. Is this true? Well, let's look at the facts. First, the portion of cost that can be passed on to consumers depends on consumer and retailer responsiveness to price. In economics, we refer to this as the elasticity of demand. As an example, one survey of California growers covered by the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement showed that farms were unable to raise prices to account for additional food safety expenses. In any event, economic theory suggests that farms of different sizes and types pass on costs at different rates. This means that if all are required to test, the impact on farms will vary. Economies of scale suggest that economic pressures will typically be greatest on smaller farms, potentially leading to cutbacks and other potentially more effective interventions. Some of these farms may fail, leading to less competition in the industry. Again, generally speaking, resources for food safety investments are limited. Therefore, it's important to optimize investments in food safety. So what can we say about the claim that testing costs can be passed on to the consumer? I would say that this is a mostly busted myth. Although consumers are expected to pay part of the cost of testing, farmers' food safety costs will be distributed across the supply chain. Some evidence suggests that farms pay a large share of these costs. Finally, ineffective high testing levels may lead to greater product risk if funds are unavailable for other interventions. In summary, I think we've learned a number of different things, including the idea that farmers are incentivized to avoid outbreaks and recalls. Testing is one of many tools used to improve food safety. Intensive routine testing does not eliminate risk. Optimal testing levels depend on environmental and farm factors. Effects of testing on liability are limited. Intensive routine testing costs can be high and are distributed across the supply chain and consumers. And finally, if high testing costs lead to economizing on other more effective food safety practices, overall food safety risk may increase. Thank you for your time. I look forward to talking to you in future webinars given by the contact group.